She once believed that love was the only thing that could protect her. But tonight, standing amidst the tearing gunfire, clutching a stranger's child, Seraphina Vale finally understood the cruelest truth. The man she had loved for 8 years never deserved a single tear from her, and the man emerging from the smoke before her, cold, dangerous, his cloak stained red with blood, was the only one who truly saw who she was. This is the story of a woman utterly destroyed and reborn into something more terrifying than anything that had ever crushed her. If you're watching this far, please watch to the end, and comment with the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has progressed. The morning Seraphina Vale signed away 8 years of her life, it was raining. Not the soft, cinematic kind of rain that makes people feel romantic or melancholy in equal measure. This was the kind of rain that meant something, cold, relentless, hammering against the courthouse windows like it was trying to break through the glass and drown everything inside. The fluorescent lights above her head buzzed with that particular frequency that lives somewhere between a headache and a scream. And the clerk behind the counter hadn't looked up from her phone once in the last 20 minutes. Seraphina signed her name on the last page. Her hand didn't shake. She'd expected it to shake. She'd spent 3 days dreading that moment. The trembling fingers, the visible weakness, the way Damon would see it and feel satisfied. But her hand was perfectly still, pressing the pen down hard enough to leave indentations on the paper beneath. 3 copies. The clerk stamped each one without ceremony, separated them into separate folders with the practiced efficiency of someone who processed human wreckage 8 hours a day. "You're all set," the woman said, still not looking up. Seraphina picked up her single copy and walked out. The courthouse steps were slick with rain. She stood at the top of them for a moment with no umbrella, no coat adequate for this kind of cold, and no particular destination. The town car she'd arrived in, the last vestige of the life she was leaving, sat idling at the curb. Inside it, Damon Mercer waited with the patience of a man who'd already decided how this scene would end. She walked down the steps and got in. He was on his phone. He didn't look up immediately, which was its own kind of message, one he'd been sending for years in the language of small cruelties. His suit was charcoal gray with a faint window pane check, perfectly pressed, the collar bright white except for a faint pinkish smear near the second button that he'd missed when he changed this morning. Seraphina looked at that smear and felt nothing. Not rage, not grief, not the sick hollow twist she'd braced herself for. Just nothing, flat and wide as still water. "Done?" he asked, pocketing his phone. "Done." He nodded, already looking out the opposite window. The city scrolled past in gray and wet, steel and glass, and people hunched under umbrellas, everyone moving somewhere with purpose. Damon tapped 2 fingers against his knee, a habit she'd once found endearing and had spent the last 2 years wanting to break along with the fingers themselves. "The lawyers will handle the asset division by Friday," he said. "You should have your account sorted within a week." "I know how the timeline works, Damon. I'm just saying, there's no need to make this difficult." She turned to look at him then. Really look. The jaw she'd once thought was the most beautiful jaw she'd ever seen on a human being. The slight asymmetry of it that had seemed like character rather than flaw. The eyes that had looked at her on their wedding night like she was something rare and precious, and had spent the subsequent years looking at her like she was furniture he'd gotten bored of. The lipstick on his collar, pale pink, almost imperceptible, unless you were a woman who had spent years paying attention to details. Because paying attention to details was how you survived living with someone like him. "You're right," she said. "No need." The car pulled up to the building where she was staying temporarily, a friend's apartment, borrowed, because the penthouse had been his, and the house in the hills had been his. And the truth she'd avoided for years was that most of what she'd thought was theirs had always only been his. She had a suitcase upstairs and a box of books and not much else. She reached for the door handle. "Seraphina." She stopped, didn't turn around. "You were never built for this world," Damon said. "I hope you understand that now. I wasn't cruel. I was realistic." She sat with that for 3 full seconds. Outside, rain drummed against the roof of the car. A woman walked past on the sidewalk holding a yellow umbrella, a small boy tugging her hand, both of them laughing at something private. "Goodbye, Damon," Seraphina said, and stepped out into the rain. She didn't look back. She told herself she didn't look back. The apartment belonged to Cassie Reyes, who was currently in Prague on a photography assignment, and had texted Seraphina the door code with a string of heart emojis and the words "burn his suits if you get the chance." It was small and warm and cluttered with plants that needed watering and half-finished canvases propped against every vertical surface. It smelled like turpentine and old coffee, and something floral Seraphina couldn't identify. She set her bag down just inside the door and stood in the middle of the living room for a very long time. The silence was different here than it had been in the penthouse. The penthouse silence had been expensive, engineered by triple-paned windows and strategic soundproofing and a building designed to keep the world out. This silence was just the normal quiet of a life paused, the refrigerator humming, rain finding the windowsills, the muffled bass of someone's music 2 floors up. It was ordinary in a way Seraphina hadn't experienced in years, and it hit her somewhere behind the sternum with unexpected force. She sat down on the edge of Cassie's couch and pressed both hands flat against her thighs. "You were never built for this world." She thought about the first time Damon had said something like that. Not in those words. He'd been subtler at the beginning, more artful about it. The small corrections at dinner parties, the gentle redirections when she spoke confidently about something, the way he'd started finishing her sentences in the last 2 years and always finishing them wrong. The architecture of it had been so gradual she hadn't noticed she was being dismantled until she was already in pieces. Her phone buzzed. Then again. Then a sustained vibration that meant a call. The screen showed a photo of Damon at the charity gala 6 months ago, laughing with his head thrown back, handsome and effortless in a tuxedo, his arm around a woman Seraphina had been introduced to as a business associate. The name above the photo read Damon. She stared at it until it stopped. Then she set the phone face down on the cushion beside her and stared at the rain on Cassie's window for a while. Yeah. She lasted in the apartment for 4 days before the walls started pressing in. Not literally, not in a way she could have explained to anyone. Just the particular specific sensation of a life contracting, of existing in a space defined entirely by what she was no longer. She wasn't Seraphina Mercer anymore. She wasn't the woman in the penthouse, or the woman at the galas, or the woman who'd learned to make herself smaller and quieter and less until she fit into whatever shape Damon required. But she also didn't know yet what she was, instead, and the not knowing had a weight to it that sat on her chest when she tried to sleep. On the 4th night, she went walking. It wasn't wisdom, it wasn't strategy. It was just that the walls of Cassie's apartment had reached the point where staying inside felt physically impossible. And so she put on her coat and her boots and went out into the city at 11:15 on a Tuesday with no destination and the distant buzzing behind her eyes that came from not sleeping enough and crying too much and eating too little for 4 consecutive days. The city at night had a different grammar than the city in daylight. The neighborhood she was in sat at the border between 2 different economic realities. The boutiques and restaurants of the main street giving way 2 blocks north to older buildings, narrower sidewalks, the smell of grease and diesel, and the faint chemical sweetness of something Seraphina preferred not to identify. She walked north without meaning to, because north was where the streets opened up and the foot traffic thinned out, and she could hear her own footsteps on the wet pavement. She was 3 blocks from Cassie's building when she heard the first shot. The sound was nothing like television. It was sharper, flatter, a crack that split the ambient city noise with surgical precision and sent every bird on the block into the sky simultaneously. Seraphina stopped walking. Her whole body went rigid with an instinct older than thought. Freeze, locate, assess. A second shot, then 4 in rapid succession. They were coming from the alley to her left. A narrow passage between 2 concrete buildings, the mouth of it blocked by a dumpster leaking dark water across the asphalt. Without understanding why she was doing it, Seraphina pressed herself against the building wall and looked around the dumpster into the dark. What she saw stopped her breathing. 2 black SUVs angled across each other at the far end of the alley, headlights blazing. Men in dark clothing moved between parked vehicles, using them as cover, the muzzle flash from their weapons creating stuttering white light in the rain. Another group had come from the opposite end, boxing the first in. 4 or 5 men, she couldn't count precisely in the chaos, all of them moving with trained efficiency. The ground was wet and the sound of the rain was almost enough to swallow the shouting, but not quite. A small body hit the ground next to the dumpster directly beside her. Not a man. A boy. 8, maybe 9 years old, wearing a blue jacket that was too thin for the weather, his face white with terror, his back pressed against the concrete wall with his arms wrapped tight around his own knees. He looked at Seraphina with eyes that held something she recognized viscerally, the particular expression of someone who has been afraid for long enough that fear has stopped being an emotion and started being a physical state. She didn't think. She moved. She dropped to her knees on the wet asphalt beside him and wrapped both arms around him and pulled him against her body, turning them both so her back was to the alley, using herself as a wall between the boy and whatever was happening 20 feet away. He grabbed her coat with both fists and pressed his face into her shoulder, and she felt him shaking, the full-body tremor of someone whose system was overloaded past the point of control. "It's okay," she said, which was a lie, but it was the only thing available. "I've got you. Don't look." The gunfire intensified. A vehicle window shattered. Someone screamed. A raw, specific sound that had no civilian equivalent, the kind of scream that communicated damage rather than fear. Seraphina flattened herself further against the wall and kept her arms locked around the boy and kept telling him things that may or may not have been true because there was nothing else she could do from where she was. And then the gunfire stopped. Not gradually. All at once, like a switch thrown. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Seraphina had ever heard. She didn't move. She kept the boy pressed against her and counted her own heartbeats, which were loud and irregular, and waited. Footsteps. A single set, unhurried, moving toward her end of the alley. Not running, walking. The particular cadence of someone who had no need to run because the thing they were walking toward wasn't going anywhere, and they already knew it. Seraphina turned her head. The man who stepped around the dumpster was tall. Not the theatrical tall of film or fiction, but the functional tall of a man who had built himself into a specific instrument over many years. He wore a charcoal overcoat, long, double-breasted, and there was a dark stain spreading from his left shoulder that caught the faint light from the street behind her. His hair was dark, cut close on the sides, and his face was the kind of face that doesn't offer anything easily. The architecture of control rather than emotion, every feature arranged with the economy of someone who had learned early that expressions were leverage and leverage was never given away for free. He stopped when he saw her. Not when he saw the alley was occupied. Not when he registered her presence as obstacle or threat. He stopped at the specific moment he understood what he was looking at. A woman on her knees in the rain, arms wrapped around a child she didn't know, back turned toward the violence to shield the smaller body with her own. His eyes were very dark. She couldn't have named the color in that light. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the boy. Then he said, in a voice that was low and even, and carried the particular texture of someone who chose every word the way other people chose weapons, "Is he hurt?" "No," Seraphina said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Are you going to hurt us?" Something crossed his face. Not amusement exactly, but adjacent to it. A flicker in the controlled surface of him that acknowledged the question as something more than noise. "No," he said. Behind him, 3 men appeared at the mouth of the alley. Large, dark-clothed, armed with weapons they'd stopped bothering to conceal. They fanned out with the silent coordination of people who had done this before and understood exactly where to stand. The tall man didn't look at them. He kept looking at Seraphina. "There are more of them," he said. "The men who started this. They'll circle back in 3 minutes looking for survivors." "That's not a lot of time." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He crouched down to her level then, an unexpected motion, reducing his height, bringing his eyes level with hers. Up close, the stain on his shoulder was definitely blood, and there was a cut on the line of his jaw that had bled down his neck and dried there. He looked at her with those dark eyes, and she had the strange sensation of being red, not evaluated for threat, but genuinely red, the way a person looks at something they need to understand rather than something they need to control. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes." "The boy?" "I think so." He glanced at the child still clinging to her coat. Something shifted in his expression. A fraction of softness, barely perceptible, there and then gone like a coin dropped into water. "Then come with me," he said. He stood and offered his hand. She didn't take it. She got to her feet on her own, pulling the boy up with her, keeping one hand on his shoulder. The tall man registered her not taking his hand, and something in his posture adjusted by degrees so small she couldn't have measured them, but she felt the adjustment. "My name is Lucien Draven," he said. She knew the name. Everyone who'd lived in this city for more than 6 months knew the name, though most people had never attached it to a face. It existed in the space between rumor and fact, in newspaper articles that went quiet, in conversations that changed subject without explanation, in the specific way certain people's expressions reorganized themselves when the name came up. Seraphina looked at him. "Seraphina Vale," she said. He nodded once, as though the name meant something, and turned toward the street. She followed him. She would think about that decision for a very long time afterward. The moment she followed Lucien Draven out of a gunshot-scarred alley in the rain, with a child's hand wrapped around 3 of her fingers, and the divorce papers from this morning still folded in her coat pocket. She would turn the decision over and examine it from different angles. The way you examine a stone you picked up without thinking, looking for what made you choose it. What she always came back to was this. She hadn't followed him out of fear. She hadn't followed him because she had nowhere else to go, though that was true. She hadn't followed him because he was powerful, or because the alternative, standing in that alley alone when the men came back, was worse. She followed him because when he looked at her, he didn't look at a broken woman. He looked at someone who'd done something. And in 4 days of suffocating silence in Cassie's apartment, that was the only thing anyone had offered her that felt like air. The SUV they put her in smelled like leather and gunpowder and very faint cologne. Expensive, understated, the kind of thing you notice more as absence than presence. The boy had fallen asleep against her arm within 90 seconds of the door closing, the crash of adrenaline hitting him like a wall. She held him steady as the vehicle moved and watched the city outside the tinted windows become unfamiliar neighborhoods, and then an avenue she recognized, and then a district she recognized, and then something she'd only ever seen from the outside, the tower, Draven Tower. 43 stories of black glass and steel in the financial district, the kind of building that communicated its function through architecture alone. It appeared in real estate listings sometimes, briefly, before disappearing. Nobody seemed to own an office there. Nobody seemed to know exactly what it housed. It had the specific quality of something that existed at a slight angle from the city around it, present, but not quite subject to the same rules. The SUV descended into a private underground entrance. The garage was clean, brightly lit, populated with vehicles that ranged from the deliberately inconspicuous to the deliberately not. Men moved with purpose. Nobody looked at her with curiosity, which told her something about the culture of this place. Either they were trained to show nothing, or they'd seen stranger things than a damp woman and a sleeping child arrive in the back of the car. A woman in her 50s met them at the elevator. Gray-streaked hair pulled back, dark suit, the kind of face that had learned to be neutral as a professional skill. "Mrs. Vale," she said, as though this were expected. "Ms." Seraphina said, from instinct. The woman didn't blink. "Ms. Vale, I'm Alara Voss. I handle operational matters for Mr. Draven." She looked at the sleeping boy. "The child, his name is Marco. He's been missing for 6 days. His family has been notified. He'll be transported safely once he's slept." "How do you know?" "It's what we do," Alara said, in a tone that didn't invite further questions. She looked at Seraphina more carefully. "Are you injured?" "No." "You're certain?" Seraphina looked down at herself. Her jeans were soaked through at the knees from the alley ground. Her coat was... She reached into the pocket and pulled out the folded papers. The top edge was blotted with mud. She looked at it for a moment. "I'm fine," she said. Alara showed her to a room on the 31st floor. Clean, spare, expensive, in the way that doesn't perform itself. Quality materials without ornament. A window that looked out over the city from a height that made it feel abstract and beautiful. A bathroom with towels that had never been used. A closet with clothing that fit her, which shouldn't have been possible but was, and which she chose not to examine too closely. She stood in the middle of the room for a long moment. Then she walked to the window and pressed one hand flat against the glass and looked down at the city she'd lived in for 8 years. The city that had watched her arrive bright-eyed and full of specific future, and had watched her get smaller over the years. And she felt the things she'd been holding at bay since the courthouse steps begin to move through her like weather. Slow, heavy, impossible to stop. She didn't cry the way she'd expected to cry. There were no sobs, no dramatic collapse. What happened was quieter and more total, her whole body simply releasing something it had been holding rigid for so long that releasing it felt almost identical to breaking. She stood at the window and shook for a few minutes. Then she stopped. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and breathed until her breathing was even. Outside, the city moved and glittered and continued its indifferent business under the rain. She didn't sleep much. When the dark finally thinned toward gray, she was sitting in the chair by the window with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the city's lights go from gold to pale in the early morning, working through the facts of her situation with the systematic focus she'd once used to run the financial operations of Damon's foundation. She'd been good at that work. He'd never mentioned it was good work. That would have required acknowledging the competence she brought to it. But the foundation's numbers had been clean, and the audits had been smooth, and she knew, in the careful private way she'd maintained against the years of erosion, that she'd been very good indeed. There was a knock at the door at 7:15. She got up and opened it. Lucien stood in the hallway. He'd changed. The overcoat gone, his shoulder attended to, wearing dark trousers and a black shirt with the first two buttons open, the cut on his jaw cleaned and covered. He looked entirely at ease, which she was beginning to understand was not the absence of tension, but the presence of a very complete control. He had 2 cups of coffee. He held one out. She took it. He leaned against the doorframe rather than entering. Another registered detail. The door remained the line between his space and hers, and he didn't step across it without invitation. "Marco is with his family," he said. "Good." He was taken by a rival group as leverage. He shouldn't have been in that alley, so they'd transported him there during the exchange, and it went wrong. He studied her over the rim of his cup. Most people in that situation would have run. Most people weren't already having a worse day. He was quiet for a moment, then, "What were you doing in that neighborhood at 11 at night?" "Walking." "Toward anything in particular?" "Away from things in general." He looked at her, that reading quality again, the sense of being processed in real time without being reduced by the process. "You're welcome to stay," he said, "until you've determined your next step." "Why?" "Because I would like you to." She considered that, the plainness of it. No performance of generosity, no elaborate justification. "That's not actually a reason," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's a statement of intent. The reason is more complicated, and I'm not going to offer it to a woman I've known for 6 hours at 7 in the morning." Something small moved through her. Not warmth exactly, but the precursor to it. The recognition of something honest. "I'll stay a few days," she said. He nodded, pushed off the doorframe. "Breakfast at 8, he said. "If you want it." She watched him walk down the hallway, unhurried, that same measured stride. And she stood in the doorway with the coffee growing warm between her palms and thought about what Damon had said in the car. "You were never built for this world." She drank the coffee. Maybe, she thought, she'd been built for a different one entirely. She didn't leave after a few days. She didn't leave after a week. It happened without being decided. A gradual accumulation of reasons that felt, individually, trivial, and collectively like something she didn't want to examine too closely for fear of misidentifying it. Alara provided her with access to guest accounts on the building's systems while her own arrangements were being sorted. There was work she could do, number work, organizational work, the language she'd always spoken fluently, and Lucien's operation had the bones of good structure under layers of deliberate opacity, and she found herself looking at those bones with the involuntary attention of someone who can't walk past a problem without wanting to understand it. Lucien noticed. He didn't say much about it at first. He would find her in the building's secondary conference room, the one with the view of the eastern skyline, with printed spreadsheets and a laptop and a legal pad covered in her handwriting, and he would look at what she was working on without comment and then leave and come back an hour later with a question that required the exact kind of analysis she'd been doing. 2 weeks in, she handed him a document outlining 3 structural inefficiencies in the Foundation's public-facing financial reporting. He read it in her presence, which she'd noticed was his habit. He didn't read things later. He read them while you waited, and his face told you nothing while he did. He set it down. Where did you learn this? He asked. I managed the reporting for the Mercer Charitable Foundation for 6 years. Your husband's organization. My organization, she said, that he put his name on. Lucien picked up the document again and read the second page. This would have cost me $400,000 over the next fiscal year, he said. Closer to $600 if the pattern held. He set it down again and looked at her. What do you want? He said. The question landed like something dropped from a height. She'd spent so many years fielding variations of what do you need and what can I get you and what are you trying to achieve that this particular formulation, what do you want, simple and direct and pointed exactly at her, made her pause in a way that embarrassed her. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He nodded. That's an acceptable answer for now. She spent the night thinking about it. What do you want? The answer that came back, slowly and in pieces like wreckage washing up, wasn't the answer she'd expected. It wasn't Damon's ruin or her revenge or any of the things she'd thought she was supposed to want after a marriage like hers had ended. It was simpler and more frightening. She wanted to be someone again, not someone's wife, not the foundation behind the man, not the competence and the invisibility and the careful maintenance of another person's image, just someone with her own weight in the world. Seraphina Vale lay in the spare room on the 31st floor of Draven Tower and stared at the ceiling and let herself want that with her whole chest. Let herself want it without qualification or apology. For the first time in years. Outside, the city moved and breathed in the dark. And somewhere else in the building, Damon Mercer's name was already appearing in documents he hadn't seen yet. Documents that would, if she'd known they existed, have told her that the man she'd married hadn't just destroyed their marriage. He'd borrowed money from people who kept very specific records of debts, and those records were in this building. And the man who owned them was the same man who'd handed her coffee at 7 in the morning and asked with absolute sincerity what she wanted. She didn't know yet, but she was about to find out. The documents existed on paper only. That was the first thing Seraphina noticed when Alara Voss led her into the records room on the 28th floor 3 weeks after her arrival. No digital trail, no cloud backup, no networked system that could be accessed from outside the building. Everything printed, organized, filed in matte black binders with date codes on the spines, stored in a room with climate control, and a door that required 2 separate key inputs to open. The kind of system that communicated one thing clearly. Whoever maintained it trusted paper more than people. Mr. Draven wants you to have access to the foundation materials, Alara said, the 3rd and 4th shelves. The others are not your concern. Seraphina looked at the other shelves. Understood, she said. Alara left. Seraphina pulled a binder from the 3rd shelf, carried it to the table in the center of the room, and opened it. Foundation financials, the last 3 fiscal years, third-party audited. She'd spent 20 minutes with the first quarterly report before her eyes drifted, involuntarily, the way a tongue finds a sore tooth, to the 5th shelf. The binders there were older. The date codes started 7 years back. The labels were alphanumeric rather than descriptive. She didn't touch them. She went back to the foundation materials and worked for 3 hours and didn't think about the 5th shelf, or at least told herself she wasn't thinking about it, which is a different thing entirely. Lucien found her in the conference room at 6 that evening. She'd moved from the records room to her usual table by the eastern window, the legal pad now dense with annotations. The laptop opened to a spreadsheet she'd rebuilt from scratch because the existing version had errors compounded across multiple quarters that someone had either missed or chosen not to correct. He sat down across from her without asking. She'd noticed he didn't ask permission to sit, not with arrogance, but with the specific economy of a man who had learned to read when his presence was welcome and when it wasn't, and acted accordingly. He read the legal pad upside down, which she'd also noticed he could do with apparent ease. The Carver event is Friday, he said. The Black Monarch Gala. Yes, I know what it is. She kept her eyes on the spreadsheet. I've been in this city for 8 years. I'd like you to attend. She looked up. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention, complete, unhurried, taking in the whole of her without making it feel like appraisal. There was a glass of water on the table that she hadn't noticed being placed there, and she understood from context that it had been Lucien rather than staff, which was a small thing and also somehow not a small thing. Why? She said. Because you're useful to me in that room, he said, and because there are people who will be there who need to understand your position has changed. My position. You are no longer Damon Mercer's discarded wife, he said. The flatness with which he said it was not cruelty. It was the particular tone of a man stating a fact he considered beneath discussion. Whether or not you've decided what you are instead. She held his gaze for a moment. That's a loaded invitation. Most honest ones are. And if I go, what does that look like? To the room, to everyone in it. What story are we telling? The true one, Lucien said, which is that you're there because you chose to be there. She tapped the pen against the legal pad twice. I'll think about it, she said. He stood. She expected him to push. Damon would have pushed, would have recalibrated the request into something that looked like a choice, but functioned as an instruction. Instead, Lucien picked up the legal pad, read 2 lines of her annotations, set it back down with the same deliberate care he handled everything, and walked toward the door. There's one other thing, he said, without turning. Yes, Damon Mercer attended a meeting last Tuesday at the Hayworth Hotel, private dining room. He met with 3 men from the Castillo organization. The name sat in the air between them. The Castillo organization. She knew the name the way she knew Lucien's, but from the geography of things left unspoken, from the careful way people's voices changed when it came up. If Lucien Draven was the city's invisible king, the Castillo organization was the rival kingdom that had been at war with his for going on a decade. Different methods, different territory, the same fundamental business conducted with considerably less discipline. What kind of meeting? She said. Lucien turned then. His expression was exactly what it always was, controlled, surface still, but something had shifted in the arrangement of his shoulders. The kind that ends with a contract, he said. She understood what he was telling her. She kept her face level. You're telling me because you think I should know, she said, or because you think I already do. The question had an edge to it that surprised her on the way out. The sharpness of someone who'd spent years being managed with partial information and had developed an instinct for detecting it like a change in air pressure. Lucien looked at her for a moment. Because you should know, he said, and because I don't operate on assumptions. He left. Seraphina sat with the quiet for a long time after, her hand still on the pen, not writing anything. p.m. Friday arrived with cold clarity. The rain had broken and the city sat under a sky the specific pale gray of old ice, every surface sharp-edged in the hard autumn light. Ilara appeared at Seraphina's door at 4 in the afternoon with a garment bag and the composed expression of someone delivering information rather than a gift. Mr. Draven asked that you have options, Ilara said. Seraphina unzipped the bag. The gown inside was midnight silver. Not sequin, nothing theatrical, but the fabric caught light the way water catches it, shifting from near black to luminous, depending on the angle. It was the kind of clothing that understood it was armor. She ran 2 fingers along the seam at the waist and thought about the last gala she'd attended on Damon's arm, the navy dress he'd approved, the careful adjustments he'd made to her hair at the car door that she'd understood even then were corrections rather than affection. She put the gown on. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment, really looked, the way she'd stopped doing somewhere around year 4 with Damon, when looking in the mirror had started to produce a complex, unwanted audit of every visible deficiency he'd cataloged over the preceding months. The woman in the mirror looked back, not young in the way she'd been young, not unmarked, but present. That was the word she kept coming back to. Present in herself in a way she hadn't been for years. The silver gown made her look like she'd decided something. She supposed she had. The Black Monarch Gala occupied the entirety of the Aldrich Hotel's main ballroom. 3,000 square feet of crystal and gilded ceiling, and a guest list that existed at the precise intersection of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary ambiguity. These were people who had learned to coexist without asking each other direct questions about the nature of their businesses. Politicians next to developers, next to men whose organizations didn't appear in any public registry. The city's entire architecture of power, dressed and present and performing its own beautiful theater. The room noticed Seraphina Vale. It noticed her before she'd taken 20 steps inside. before the initial ripple of recognition had fully traveled from the entrance to the farthest tables. She could feel it, not in any single gaze, but in the aggregate shift of attention, the quality of silence that appeared briefly in conversational clusters as people registered what they were seeing. She recognized the phenomenon from the other side, from years of being the one already present when someone new entered and caused this particular rearrangement of the room's attention. Lucien Draven's hand rested at the small of her back. Not possessively in the way Damon had touched her. Damon's hand at her back had always had a steering quality, guiding her away from certain conversations, redirecting her trajectory without appearing to. This was different. It was a statement rather than a tool. She felt it through the fabric of the gown, a point of steady warmth, and she kept her chin level and her spine straight and let the room process what it was seeing. She saw Damon from across the ballroom before he saw her. He was standing with a cluster of men near the bar, still well-dressed, still performing the ease of someone who belonged there, but something in the performance had loosened at the edges. She'd spent 8 years learning to read him, and what she read now was the specific tension of a man who was maintaining appearances over a substrate of genuine alarm. His new woman was beside him, beautiful and young and attentive in the way of someone still learning the job. His hand around his glass was slightly too tight. Then he turned his head. Seraphina watched it happen. The recognition traveling through his face in phases. First her, then the gown, then the man standing beside her, then the precise position of that man's hand. She watched his expression try 4 different configurations in under 2 seconds and settle on none of them, landing finally on something that read as controlled but was breathing hard underneath. She held eye contact for 3 seconds. Then she looked away first, not because she had to, but because she chose to. Because looking away first was also a kind of power, when you did it right. Lucien spoke quietly near her ear, not leaning in, just lowering his voice. He's been watching the door since 10 minutes before we arrived. I know, she said. Does that change anything for you? She considered the question honestly. The candlelight moved across the crystal in long, slow waves, and the room's orchestra played something she recognized but couldn't name, and somewhere across the marble floor, the man who'd told her she was never built for this world was holding his glass too tightly. No, she said. Damon found her alone. It wasn't an accident. She recognized the calculation behind it, the way he'd tracked her movements through the room until Lucien was occupied with a conversation at the south end of the ballroom, and then crossed toward her with the particular velocity of someone who'd been building up to something for an hour. She was standing near the balcony doors. She heard his footsteps and had already turned by the time he stopped 2 feet in front of her, which was closer than it should have been and which she understood was deliberate. Seraphina. His voice was keeping itself steady through obvious effort. Damon. What is this? He gestured, a tight, controlled motion, at the general territory of her presence in this room at this event in this gown. It's a gala, she said. You've been to several. Don't. His jaw was tight. Up close, the edges were sharper than she'd seen last. The slight gauntness of someone who hadn't been sleeping, the slight brightness of someone who'd had more to drink than his composed performance suggested. You know what I'm asking. I don't think you actually want the answer. He's using you, Damon said. His voice dropped, gaining the particular urgency of a man making a final argument. That's what he does. He collects useful people and he uses them. And when they stop being useful, stop, she said. He stopped. You had 8 years, Seraphina said. 8 years to talk to me like you're talking to me right now, with urgency, with directness, like what I thought and felt and knew actually mattered. She kept her voice level, each word clean and placed with care. You spent most of those years making sure I understood that it didn't. Something moved through his face. I'm not done. She met his eyes. I found a lipstick stain on your collar on the day we signed the divorce papers. Not because you wanted me to see it, because you didn't think it was worth hiding. That's not a man who believes his wife is worth the effort of a lie, Damon. That's a man who stopped considering his wife entirely. The silence between them ran for 4 full seconds. So no, she said. What's happening here has nothing to do with being used. I know what being used feels like. She tilted her head slightly. They said the same thing about you once, that you were the dangerous choice, that I was making a mistake. His face did something complicated. And they were right, she said, but not for the reasons they thought. She stepped past him toward the balcony doors. Don't approach me at events again, she said without looking back. We are finished at every level, professionally, personally, legally, all of it. And if you come to me again with the story that you're warning me about someone dangerous. She paused at the threshold, the cool night air touching her face from the gap in the door. Remember that I already know exactly what a dangerous man looks like. I was married to one. She pushed through the doors and stood on the balcony with the cold night air moving around her and the city below in its full geometric splendor, and let the anger move through her clean and fast like weather, the way healthy anger does when you haven't spent years compressing it into something corrosive. She stayed there for 4 minutes. Then she went back inside. She found Lucien at the edge of the room, alone for the moment, which never lasted long, men and women migrating toward him and then receding again in the particular social pattern of people who wanted proximity to power, but were also calibrated to know when proximity had reached its limit. He looked at her when she approached. Better? He said. Different, she said. He handed her a glass without commentary. There are 3 men in this room, she said quietly, who've been watching you specifically since we arrived. Not the usual watching, the kind with a purpose. He didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on her. I know, he said. Castillo organization? Associates of. Damon was speaking to one of them earlier, before he came to find me. She kept her voice even. Near the east corridor, about 4 minutes before he crossed the room. Something sharpened in Lucien's expression. Not alarm. His face wasn't built for alarm, but a precise recalibration, the look of someone updating a model in real time. You're certain? I watched them for 6 minutes. The man he was talking to, early 50s, gray at the temples, standing with the group near the second pillar from the entrance, passed Damon something small, card or paper. Damon put it in his jacket pocket and left the conversation inside of 30 seconds. Lucien was quiet for a moment. Most people wouldn't have noticed that, he said. Most people weren't trained to survive a marriage by paying attention to things their husband didn't want them to see. He looked at her. In the warm light of the ballroom, with the orchestra working through its measured paces and the city's power conducting its careful theater all around them, Seraphina held his gaze and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, not safety. Those words were too small and too available. But the particular sensation of being in the right place, the specific gravity of a moment that was real. Come, Lucien said, and turned toward the far end of the room. She followed. The next 9 days had the quality of a tide going out. Seraphina threw herself into the foundation work with the focus of someone who had found purpose and wasn't going to be cautious with it. The inefficiencies she'd identified in the first review turned out to be 3 layers deep. The surface errors sitting on top of structural problems that went back 4 years and required full reconstruction of the reporting architecture, rather than simple correction. She worked 12-hour days in the conference room with the eastern view, and Alara brought her coffee without being asked, and Lucien stopped by twice a day with questions that she eventually understood were not requests for information he lacked, but a way of thinking through problems in company. He talked to her differently than anyone had talked to her in a long time. Not differently gentle or differently careful, differently honest. He didn't frame things to protect her from the friction of reality. When she asked him direct questions, he gave her direct answers, and when the answers were things she might not want to hear, he delivered them with the same even tone he used for everything, which was more respect than most people's performances of sensitivity. She was beginning to understand that the composure wasn't emptiness, it was structure, built over something real at some cost. On the 9th day, she found him in the records room. He was standing in front of the 5th shelf. He turned when she came in. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Damon borrowed from the Castillo organization 18 months ago, Lucien said. He didn't seem surprised to see her. 7 million. He gave them access to the city council contacts he'd cultivated for 10 years as partial security. The number sat between them. That's not the kind of debt you pay back, she said. No. And the Castillo organization came to the gala because because Damon has missed 2 payment deadlines and they wanted him to understand that options were narrowing. She looked at the 5th shelf. The binder's there. Is his name on those binders? Lucien followed her eyes. A beat. Yes, he said. Is mine. He turned to look at her fully. It was, he said, as his wife. The account they used as secondary collateral was joint. The word landed like a stone dropped in still water. The impact small, the circles spreading outward in all directions, touching every edge of the room. She stood with that for a moment. So they can come after me, she said. They could try, Lucien said. They won't. Because of you. Because of choices that have already been made. He kept his eyes on her face. I need you to understand what that means. What it means to have my name attached to yours in this city. Tell me. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitation. She was learning to read him well enough to know the difference between hesitation and deliberate pacing. It means Damon's options have narrowed further, he said finally. He's been trying to negotiate with the Castillo people by offering them something new, something with more value than $7 million. What does he have left to offer? Lucien looked at her, and she understood. The understanding moved through her, not like shock, but like a horrible confirmation of something her body had known before her mind caught up. The animal knowledge of a target that has finally seen the angle of approach. Me, she said. He's offering them information about me. About your access to this building. Your access to me. Lucien's voice was absolutely level. He knows you've been inside Draven Tower for 3 weeks. He doesn't know what you do here, but the Castillo organization has made their own assumptions. They think I'm an asset you're running. They think you're leverage they can acquire. She reached out and put her hand flat on the table beside her. A grounding gesture, feeling the cool, solid surface of it. When? She said. We intercepted communications 2 days ago. They've planned something for the harbor exchange Friday night. Damon was on the call. He paused. He didn't volunteer the information about you. He offered it when they threatened to expose his debts publicly. She thought about the man she'd been married to for 8 years, the man who'd arranged her humiliation at the courthouse with the deliberate care of an event planner, the man who'd told her she was never built for this world. He knows what would happen to me if they took me, she said. Yes. And he offered it anyway. Lucien said nothing. The nothing was its own answer. She pushed off from the table and walked to the window at the far end of the records room. A narrow window facing north, the city in its midday geometry, cranes and glass towers and the distant horizontal line of the harbor. She stood there with her back to him and her arms folded across her chest and let the full weight of it settle. The man she'd mourned, and she had mourned him beneath the anger, beneath the numbness, the way you mourn anyone you spent 8 years believing in, had looked at the list of available resources and put her name on it, not in a moment of panic, not as a last resort he regretted, on a phone call deliberately in exchange for more time to protect himself. Friday, she said. Yes. Tell me what you need from me before then. She heard him move, the slight shift of his weight, that measured quality of motion. And then he was standing beside her at the window, not touching her, looking out at the same geography of city. Nothing, he said. I need you to stay in the building. That's not what I'm asking. A pause. I know, he said. Lucien. She turned to look at him. Up close like this, his face had the same architecture it always had. The control, the structure, the surface that gave nothing away for free. But she could read him better than she'd been able to 3 weeks ago. And what she read now was something careful, something held in check with precise effort. He's going to use this exchange to try to kill you. That has been tried before. Not with inside information. The inside information he has is limited and 3 weeks stale. Don't manage me, she said. The phrase hit something. She watched it land, watched the slight adjustment in his expression, the recognition of what she'd said and why she'd said it. I'm not managing you, he said. I'm telling you what's true. Then tell me the rest of it. He looked at her for a long moment. The harbor exchange is a secondary target, he said. The primary objective is to draw me out. If they can isolate me during the chaos at the docks, the ambush they've planned on the South Pier becomes viable, she said. Yes. And you're going anyway. Yes. She held his gaze. Then I'm going with you. Something moved through his face. Not protest exactly, but the precursor to it, the intake of breath before the objection assembled itself. That's not... My ex-husband put my name on a contract with the people trying to kill you, Seraphina said. He did that to protect himself from a debt he created by being precisely the man I spent 8 years not letting myself see clearly. She kept her voice even, each word placed. This is not your problem that I'm inserting myself into. This became mine the moment he sold me to solve it. She tilted her chin slightly. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you where I'll be. The silence in the records room lasted 8 full seconds. Lucien looked at her with those dark eyes, and whatever he was working through in the silence, he worked through it completely and came out the other side of it with his face reorganized around something she hadn't seen there before. Not just the reading, not just the controlled assessment, but something that acknowledged her as more than a problem to be protected. He looked at her the way you look at someone you've decided to trust. Friday, he said. Be ready at 10. She nodded. He walked toward the door and stopped at the threshold, the same place he always stopped, the line he didn't cross without invitation. Seraphina. Yes. When this is over, he paused. Not hesitation, pacing. There's something I need to tell you about why I know Damon's name, before any of this started. She went very still. He left without finishing the sentence. The door to the records room closed behind him with a sound like something being locked or something being opened, and Seraphina Vale stood alone among the black binders on their clean shelves and stared at the door and felt the ground beneath everything she'd built in the last 3 weeks shift by several degrees. He knew Damon's name before any of this, before the alley, before the rain, before the divorce papers folded in her coat pocket and the boy who grabbed her sleeve and the question of what she wanted asked at 7 in the morning with coffee in both hands. Before all of it, she pressed her fingers hard against the table's edge and breathed slowly through the understanding forming in the space behind her sternum, cold and precise and reshaping everything. She had 3 days until Friday, and now she didn't know what Friday was actually about. She didn't sleep. She didn't try to. She sat in the chair by the window. Her window now. She'd started thinking of it as hers without deciding to. And watched the city do its nighttime work beneath her, while the thing Lucien had left in the room rearranged itself in her mind like furniture after an earthquake. Every angle she approached it from produced the same result. He knew Damon's name before any of this started, before the alley, before the rain and the gunfire and the boy with the blue jacket, before she had any part in the story at all. She turned it over until the turning became mechanical, and then she stopped turning it and just held it, the way you hold something you've picked up without knowing yet whether it's a weapon or a wound. At 3 in the morning, she got up, put on the clothes she'd been wearing the day before, and went to find Ilara Voss. Ilara's office was on the 26th floor, a narrow room with 2 monitors and a filing system that mirrored the records room above it in its preference for physical over digital. The woman was awake. Seraphina was beginning to suspect Ilara operated on a sleep schedule that bore no relationship to conventional human biology. Seated behind her desk with a cup of something that steamed and a folder open in front of her. She looked up when Seraphina came in. She didn't look surprised. How long have you known Damon Mercer's name? Seraphina said. No preamble, no social architecture around it. She'd spent too many years wrapping difficult questions in softening language, and she was done with the habit. Ilara closed the folder. She placed both hands flat on the desk, a gesture that communicated neither guilt nor defensiveness, but the specific composure of someone who has been waiting for a conversation and has decided how to conduct it. Sit down, Ms. Vale, she said. How long? Sit down. Seraphina sat. Not because she was told to, but because her legs had the tight, unreliable quality of muscles held too long under tension, and she needed the chair under her to think clearly. Ilara picked up her cup. Drank. Set it down. Damon Mercer came to our attention 4 years ago, she said. He approached the Castillo organization through an intermediary looking for investment capital. Off-book. The kind of arrangement that requires a co-signer with sufficient street weight to guarantee the note. She paused. The Castillo organization reached out to Mr. Draven as a courtesy, or as a test, depending on how you read the relationship between them at that time, asking whether Draven would serve as a secondary guarantor. And Mr. Draven declined. He also flagged the arrangement internally because Damon Mercer's name was already in our system. Seraphina looked at the closed folder on the desk. Why was his name already in your system 4 years ago? Alara's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. A fractional reorientation toward what came next. The specific physical preparation of someone delivering information they know will cause damage. Because 3 years before that, Alara said, Damon Mercer's financial activities contributed directly to the collapse of a supply chain that Mr. Draven had significant legitimate interests in. 37 people lost employment. One of Mr. Draven's longest-standing associates lost his business and subsequently his home. She paused. Mr. Mercer was never charged. The investigation was settled privately. He was unaware that his activities had registered on anyone's radar. But you were watching him. We were watching the situation. Mr. Mercer was a thread in a larger network. For 7 years, Seraphina said. You've been watching Damon Mercer for 7 years. Intermittently. With renewed interest in the last 18 months as his financial situation deteriorated and his connections to the Castillo organization deepened. The timeline assembled itself in her mind with the horrible efficiency of something that had been waiting to be assembled. She and Damon had married 9 years ago. The supply chain collapse, the beginning of Lucien's interest in Damon's name, had happened 7 years ago. 2 years into their marriage, during the period when she'd been running the foundation's finances and Damon had been conducting the other parts of his business in rooms she wasn't invited into. The night in the alley, she said. Alara held her gaze. The exchange that went wrong that night, the one between Lucien's men and the rival group, that was connected to the Castillo investigation. It had nothing to do with Damon directly. A slight pause. Your presence in the alley was not anticipated. But my name was in your system. As Damon Mercer's wife, yes. And Lucien recognized it. When you introduced yourself, yes. The word yes delivered 3 times in the same flat tone, each one placing another piece of the picture. Seraphina sat with the assembled picture and breathed through it. In through the nose, a measured 4 count, the technique she'd developed in the last years of her marriage when Damon's behavior had pushed her toward the kind of emotional responses that required management. Did he bring me here because of Damon? She said. The question came out steady. She was proud of that, distantly. Alara looked at her for a moment. I think, Alara said, and this was the first time Seraphina had heard the woman use a phrase that acknowledged uncertainty, that Mr. Draven's initial reasons and his current ones are not the same thing. That's not an answer. It's the most honest answer I can give you from where I sit. Seraphina stood up. I need to speak with him, she said. It's 3 a.m. I'm aware of what time it is. Alara looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up her phone and dialed an internal line and said simply, Ms. Vale needs to see you, and waited, and then said understood, and hung up. 32nd floor, she said. End of the east corridor. What? She took the stairs. Not for any practical reason, the elevator was faster, but because the physical act of climbing gave her somewhere to put the thing moving through her body. The compound of anger and grief and something colder beneath both that she was still in the process of identifying. She went up 1 flight with her hand on the railing and her footsteps loud in the concrete stairwell and thought about the specific quality of being used. She knew that quality. She'd cataloged its textures across 8 years with Damon, the way it started small, with minor redirections and subtle corrections, and built gradually into something total, the process by which a person becomes instrumental rather than present in someone else's life. She knew what it felt like from the inside. She pushed through the door to the 32nd floor. The corridor was quiet, long, lit with the low overnight lighting that made every institutional space look like the same institutional space. She walked to the end of the east corridor and stopped in front of the last door and knocked twice. It opened almost immediately. Lucien had clearly not been asleep. He was dressed, dark trousers, gray shirt open at the collar, no jacket. And he had the specific alert quality of someone whose rest cycle ran shallow by habit or by history. He held the door open and stepped back from the threshold. She went in. His apartment occupied the tower's northeast corner, 2 full walls of glass, the city spread below in its nighttime entirety, a view that cost nothing to look at and everything to live inside. The space was spare in the same way the guest room was spare, quality without performance, books on the shelves not arranged for display, a desk in the corner with the evidence of active work. She turned to face him. "Tell me," she said. He closed the door. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "Damon Mercer's name has been in my system for 7 years," he said. "When you said your name in the alley, I recognized it. I brought you here because you needed immediate safety. That part was not calculated." He looked at her steadily. "What happened afterward was not planned." "That's a careful distinction." "It's an honest one. Lucien." She let the name carry the weight of everything she needed to say without the words to say it. "Did you keep me here because of what I might know about Damon?" The pause he took was 3 seconds. She counted. "In the first week?" he said. "Yes. That was part of the reason." Something in her chest compacted. "And after the first week?" He held her gaze. "You know the answer to that," he said. "I need you to say it. Because you don't trust what you know." "Because I've trusted what I thought I knew before, and I was wrong for 8 years," she said, and the steadiness in her voice cracked slightly on the last 3 words. Just slightly, just enough to be audible, and she saw him register it. He moved then, not toward her but to the window, standing with his back partially to her, looking out at the city in the way she'd come to recognize as his version of gathering himself. "You asked me once what I wanted," she said. "I've been thinking about that question for 3 weeks. What I want is not to be someone's instrument again. Not anyone's. Not Damon's. Not yours." She paused. "If what I am here is a means to an end with Damon Mercer, I need to know that now. Before Friday. Before any of it." He turned from the window. "What you are here," he said, "is the only person in this building who has argued with me twice in the same conversation and been right both times." He crossed the room, not rapidly, that measured, unhurried quality, and stopped 4 feet from her. "What you are here is someone I have told more truth to in 3 weeks than I've told most people in years, and not because it was strategically useful." He looked at her with those dark eyes, and whatever he was holding back, he held it precisely, at cost. "The information about Damon, I would have found it another way. I've had 7 years. I didn't need you for it." She held his gaze. "Then what do you need me for?" she said. The question was quieter than the others, more exposed. He was quiet for a moment. "Nothing," he said. "That's the point." She understood what he meant, the distinction between want and need, and which one was the honest currency between 2 people who had both been shaped by years of existing as useful to someone else. She stood in the middle of his living room with the city blazing below them on both sides, and let the anger work itself through to the other side of itself, where it became something more complicated and less clean. "I'm still angry," she said. "I know. Don't expect that to resolve before Friday." "I don't." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned and walked to the door and let herself out and went back down the corridor to her own floor. And she lay on the bed without taking her shoes off and stared at the ceiling until the gray light of morning began to press through the windows. She was still angry, but she knew the difference between anger at Lucien and anger at the situation, and she was honest enough with herself, in the quiet of that early morning, to sort them into their correct categories. Wednesday passed. Thursday passed. She worked through both days with a focus that excluded everything peripheral: the foundation materials, the reporting architecture, the 3 remaining structural issues she'd identified in the second layer of the financial records. She worked because work was the one domain in which she had always been most fully herself. And she needed to be fully herself right now, needed the ballast of competence and purpose against what was moving beneath everything else. Lucien gave her space. He appeared twice a day as he always had, asked questions, listened to her answers, and didn't reference the 3 o'clock conversation or the anger she'd told him was ongoing. She appreciated the precision of that. Damon had always needed her to resolve her feelings on his timeline rather than her own. The discomfort of her anger had been his discomfort, and managing her emotions had always fundamentally been about managing his experience of them. Lucien simply let her be angry. She was discovering an unusual thing. Thursday night, she was reviewing the harbor exchange logistics that Lucien had shared with her, the location, the timing, the role she was supposed to play, when Alara appeared in the doorway with an expression that was still controlled but had shed several degrees of its usual temperature. "We have a problem," Alara said. Seraphina looked up. "There's a vehicle registered to the Castillo organization that's been parked on the street outside this building for the last 4 hours," Alara said. "Stationary, running. They're watching the building. They're watching the exit point specifically. We believe they're tracking personnel movement to map our Friday response before we deploy. Have you told Lucien? He's being briefed now." Seraphina closed the laptop. She looked at the harbor exchange map on the table in front of her. The South Pier, the cargo containers, the approach routes she'd memorized because memorizing things was what she did with information she needed to survive. "The vehicle outside," she said. "How many people inside it?" "2 confirmed, possibly 3. "Same organization as the men at the gala?" "Yes." "They're not just watching the building," Seraphina said slowly. "If they've been there 4 hours, they've already mapped the exit patterns. They know when the shift changes happen. They know which vehicles leave at which times." She stood up. "They're not preparing for Friday. They've moved Friday up." Alara's expression shifted by a fraction. Seraphina was already moving to the door. She found Lucien in the operations room on the 29th floor, a space she'd only been in twice, dominated by screens and the low-frequency tension of people who managed threats for a living. 3 of his senior people were present, their conversation stopping when she entered. Lucien looked at her. He read her face in approximately 1 second. "Say it," he said. "They've moved the timeline," she said. "The vehicle outside isn't surveillance. It's the first position in an encirclement. If the harbor exchange was always the primary decoy rather than the primary target, they wouldn't need to watch the building now. They'd wait for Friday. They're watching now because Friday has become tonight." The operations room was quiet for 3 seconds. Then Lucien turned to the man on his left, late 40s, close-cropped hair, the specific economy of movement of someone with a military background. "Vasquez." "Already running the exterior feed," Vasquez said, pulling up a screen. "She's right. We've got 2 additional vehicles that registered in the last 40 minutes. Different plates, same make. East side and the service entrance on Carver Street. 3 positions, triangulated, not surveillance, a perimeter. They're going to force a response," Seraphina said. "Something that requires you to move people out of the building in a specific direction." She thought about it. The logic of it assembling itself the way financial structures assembled themselves, following the money, following the pressure. If you send personnel out to address the vehicles, you thin the building's internal security. If you don't, they escalate the exterior presence until you have to. "She's right," Vasquez said. Lucien looked at Seraphina steadily. "Go back to your floor," he said. "Lock the room." "That's not—" "Seraphina." His voice was not sharp, not raised, just absolute. "I need to work, and I need to know exactly where you are to do that. Please." The please undid the argument she was forming, not because it was a magic word, but because of the specific quality of it. Not placating, not performative, just real. She went back to her floor. She did not lock the room. The first explosion hit at 11:47. Not inside the building. The sound came from outside, the specific percussive impact of a vehicle being destroyed. And then the building's alarm system filled every corridor with its clinical screaming. Seraphina was already at the window when the second blast followed. Closer, the flash of it visible from her elevation, somewhere on the east side of the building where Vasquez had identified one of the parked vehicles. They were creating chaos, clearing the exterior, drawing Lucien's people out. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. She opened it. 4 words. "Come down. Parking level 3. She stared at it. Then her own phone rang. Her personal number, the one almost nobody had. And the name on the screen was one she hadn't seen in 4 days. Damon. She answered it because not answering it would have been the same as admitting she was afraid of what he had to say. "What do you want?" she said. Not a question. A flat declarative. "Are you in the building?" His voice was different than she'd ever heard it. Stripped of the performance, the social construction of Damon Mercer as polished and untouchable. What was underneath was smaller and more frightened and somehow worse. Seraphina, listen to me. Get out of the building right now. What have you done? I didn't have a choice. What have you done, Damon? A pause. The sound of him breathing. Rapid, shallow. Somewhere in the background she could hear traffic, open air. He was outside. I told them about the Foundation records, he said. The physical records. I told them where they're kept. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. The records room. The 28th floor. The black binders on their clean shelves with their date codes and their careful alphanumeric labels. 7 years of Lucien Draven's most sensitive documentation, maintained in physical form specifically because physical couldn't be remotely accessed or deleted. You gave them the building layout, she said. I gave them enough to... You gave them the building layout. Her voice had gone somewhere very cold. The exterior assault isn't the operation, it's the distraction. They're going in through the service access while Lucien's people are responding to the vehicles outside. She was already moving toward the door. The records room is the target. Seraphina, please, just get out. She hung up. She ran. The stairwell on the north side was the fastest route to 28. She took it at full speed, her hand on the railing at each landing, the alarm system still screaming overhead, and she thought about the 5th shelf and the black binders and the 7 years of information that had been maintained in that room specifically because it was the one thing Lucien had built that was genuinely secure, or had been, until Damon Mercer traded it for more time on a debt he should never have incurred. She hit the 28th floor landing and shoved through the door. The corridor was empty. The overhead lights were on their emergency cycle, pulsing slowly between full brightness and something dimmer, giving the hallway a quality like a held breath. She reached the records room door. Both key inputs required, Alara had said. She had neither key. She tried the handle anyway. Locked, solid, the way a door is locked when the mechanism is serious rather than decorative. She pressed her back against the wall beside the door and looked down the corridor and thought, the emergency cycle in the lights. The building's alarm had triggered a partial lockdown on sensitive floors. She'd seen the protocol documentation when she was reviewing the Foundation's operational materials. Lockdown protocol on floors 25 through 30 in the event of an external breach. Sealed access points. Automated. Which meant no one could get out of the records room either. Which meant if they'd already gotten in before the lockdown triggered, she heard the sound from inside the room. A muffled impact. Then another. The specific sound of a filing system being disrupted quickly, systematically. Not vandalism, not chaos, but targeted extraction. Someone who knew what they were looking for and knew approximately where to find it. She pressed her palm flat against the door and thought about the layout of the room. The table in the center, the shelves along 3 walls, the narrow north window. Her phone was in her hand. She called Lucien's direct line, the number he'd given her in the first week, for emergencies only, those words. And it rang twice and went to voicemail, and she understood from that alone that he was already in a situation that had consumed his full attention. She typed a text instead. Records room, 28. They're already inside. Then she looked down the corridor at the maintenance panel on the wall 30 feet away. A gray metal box she'd walked past a dozen times without registering as anything except infrastructure. She walked to it and opened it. Inside, circuit breakers, clearly labeled, and the manual override for the floor's door controls. She looked at the override switch. She looked back at the records room door. If she tripped the override, the lockdown on this floor released. Both ways. The people inside could get out, but so could she get in. She thought about the black binders on the 5th shelf. 7 years of documentation. Every name, every arrangement, every debt and contract and recorded conversation that Lucien had spent 7 years building into the most comprehensive account of how this city's power actually functioned. She thought about what happened to those records if the Castillo organization walked out of this building with them. The leverage it created. The people it exposed. The specific permanent damage of that kind of information in the wrong hands. She thought about Lucien's face when he said, "What you're here is the only person who has argued with me twice in the same conversation and been right both times." She thought about Damon's voice on the phone. "I didn't have a choice." She put her hand on the override switch. Her phone buzzed. Lucien's response to her text. Do not open that door. Vasquez is 4 minutes away. Stay in the corridor. 4 minutes. She stood with her hand on the switch and listened to the sounds from inside the records room. Systematic, efficient, accelerating. Whoever was in there was working fast and they were almost done, and 4 minutes was not 4 minutes. 4 minutes was the difference between those binders leaving this building and not leaving this building. And she was the only person standing between those two outcomes right now. She stood with her hand on the switch. She thought about the woman she'd been when she signed those divorce papers. The woman who'd let 8 years pass without using her own voice, who'd absorbed every small cruelty as though absorbing them was a virtue, who'd accepted the verdict of never built for this world as though Damon Mercer had any authority to pass verdicts on her at all. She thought about the woman she was choosing to be instead. She thought about the boy in the blue jacket grabbing her sleeve in the dark. She flipped the switch. The corridor lights went to full emergency. The magnetic lock on the records room door released with a solid mechanical thunk that she felt in her sternum. She pushed through the door. 2 men. Both turned. One was at the 5th shelf with 3 binders already tucked under his left arm, a 4th open in his right hand. The other was near the door, between her and the exit, broad, quick, with the physical vocabulary of someone trained to resolve problems with his body rather than his words. The one near the door reached for her in the same second she reached for the only thing available, the heavy metal edge of the filing cabinet beside the door frame, and she grabbed it with both hands and swung it with everything she had, the years of quiet fury and compressed grief and 8 years of swallowing her own voice, all of it behind the motion. The impact was worse than she expected. So was the pain in her hands afterward. The man went down, not unconscious but compromised, his hands going to his face, his body losing its organized quality, becoming just a person on the floor making sounds. She turned to the second man. He had put the binders down. He had a gun. She stood in the middle of the records room with her hands still vibrating from the impact of the cabinet edge and her breathing completely out of control, ragged, loud, the kind of breathing that gives everything away, and looked at the gun and at the man holding it, and understood with absolute clarity that she had just used up the last of the safety margin. The man said something in a language she didn't know. Then in English, "Step back." She didn't step back. She was very frightened. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. The fear was total, physical, occupying every available frequency of her nervous system. Her legs wanted to step back. Every reasonable system in her body was generating the same instruction on a loop. Step back, comply, survive. She didn't step back. Those records stay in this building, she said. Her voice shook on the last 3 words, and she let it shake, because there was nothing else to do with the shaking. The man looked at her. He was going to shoot her, or he wasn't, and she had spent 8 years being the woman who made herself smaller and quieter and less. And she was not going back to that woman, not now, not because of a gun in a room full of things worth protecting, not when she was the only one here to protect them. The door behind her exploded open. Vasquez, 3 seconds. The gun discharged once into the ceiling, a sound that compressed the world to a single white point of sensation. And then Vasquez had the shooter's arm at an angle that ended the immediate conversation, and 2 more of Lucien's people were through the door, and the room was suddenly full of controlled violence, and Seraphina was pressed against the shelf behind her with her hands flat on the cold metal, and her whole body shaking like something had come loose in the mechanism. She looked at the binders on the floor where the second man had put them down. Still there. All of them. She slid down the shelf until she was sitting on the floor with her back against it, her knees pulled up, her hands pressed flat on her thighs the way they'd been flat on the courthouse counter when she'd signed the papers, not shaking anymore. Something else entirely. Something past shaking. Something that lived on the other side of the threshold she'd just crossed, in the territory of a person who had looked at a gun and not stepped back. She sat there until the room was secured and the men were restrained and the sounds of the exterior assault had faded from the building's skin, and then Lucien was crouching in front of her, the same level, the same dark eyes reading her, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, not controlled, not structured, raw. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. He looked at her hands. The right one had a cut along the palm from the cabinet edge, bleeding slowly, not serious. "That's hurt," he said. "That's minor," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. I told you to stay in the corridor, he said. The rawness was still there, beneath the surface, visible the way things are visible through water. I know, she said. You could have. I know, she said again. But I didn't. She looked at the binders on the floor. And those don't leave this building tonight. He followed her eyes to the binders. He was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said her name. Just her name. Just Seraphina, with nothing attached to it. No request or instruction or judgment. And it landed in the space between them with the weight of something that had been building for 3 weeks and had just stopped pretending it wasn't there. She looked at him. Damon called me, she said, before I came down here. He gave them the building layout, Lucien. He knew exactly what they were going to do, and he told me to get out. She kept her voice steady through the last part. He didn't call to warn you. He called to warn me, which means he knew people might die in this building tonight, and his concern was me specifically. She paused. I don't know what to do with that. Lucien looked at her with that reading quality. There's something else, she said. On my phone. A text from a number I don't recognize. Come down. Parking level 3. Lucien's expression changed. Not the controlled surface shift she'd learned to read. Something deeper, faster. The response of a man whose model of a situation has just reconfigured completely around a single new data point. Show me, he said. She held out the phone. He looked at the text. He looked at the number. And something crossed his face that she'd never seen there before in 3 weeks of careful observation. Something that looked, briefly and unmistakably, like the specific expression of someone who has just understood that the situation they thought they were managing has been managing them. He stood up. Stay here, he said. Not a request, not an instruction. Something else. The voice of someone trying to contain damage that was already in motion. What is it? She said. Lucien, what's the number? He looked at her for 1 second, and then he said the name. And the name was not Damon Mercer's. It was someone else's entirely. Someone whose name she recognized from the Foundation records, from the 7th shelf in the records room she was sitting in, from the files she'd been working with for 3 weeks without understanding what they connected to. Someone who had been in this building. Someone Lucien trusted. And the ground went out from under everything all over. The name was Reeves. Cole Reeves. Seraphina sat on the floor of the records room and turned the name over in the 3 seconds before Lucien moved and tried to locate it in the architecture of everything she'd learned in the past 3 weeks. Cole Reeves. She'd seen it in the Foundation materials, third-party legal counsel, listed as a retained advisor on the operational side, present in meeting summaries going back 4 years. She'd seen it on the 7th shelf, the one that wasn't her concern, in a binder she hadn't touched. She'd heard it once, spoken quietly in the corridor outside the operations room, in a tone that communicated someone trusted enough that his name didn't require explanation. Lucien had moved to the door before she was fully on her feet. Lucien! He stopped. His back was to her. The set of his shoulders had changed. Not collapsing, nothing so legible as that. But something in the architecture of him had reorganized around a weight that hadn't been there 60 seconds ago. How long has he been with you? She said. 11 years. The number sat between them. Go, she said. He went. She followed him, not because she'd decided to disobey him a second time in the same night, but because she understood, with the specific clarity of someone who had spent 3 weeks learning to read a man who revealed almost nothing, that Lucien Draven, walking toward Cole Reeves alone tonight, was a man walking toward something he hadn't fully armored himself against yet. 11 years was not a professional relationship. 11 years was something else, something with roots, and betrayal at that depth didn't leave a person operationally clean, no matter how well they'd built themselves. She knew what that kind of betrayal did to a person. She'd had 8 years of education on the subject. She took the south stairwell. Vasquez caught her at the landing between 28 and 27, stepped out of a doorway with his hand up, not aggressive, just absolute. Ms. Vale. Where is he? She said. Mr. Draven asked. I know what he asked. Where? Vasquez looked at her for 2 seconds. He had the face of a man who had assessed threats for a living for a long time, and was currently running an assessment that had no clean output. Parking level 3, he said, but I have 2 men down there already. Then I won't be alone, she said, and went past him. He didn't stop her. Parking level 3 was below the building's security threshold. Technically part of the structure, but maintained under a separate access system, used for vehicles that needed to remain unlogged in the building's primary records. She'd seen it referenced in the operational documents without understanding its specific function. She understood it now. It was the place where things happened that didn't need witnesses. The stairwell opened into a concrete space, low ceiling, fluorescent lights at 60%, the smell of motor oil and cold stone, and something faintly chemical she couldn't identify. 6 vehicles parked in practiced anonymity, black and gray and dark blue, all of them the kind of vehicles that communicated the absence of a story. Lucien was standing 20 feet from the stairwell door. Cole Reeves was standing 30 feet further in. Seraphina had built a picture of Reeves from documents. 53, former federal prosecutor, privately retained. The kind of legal mind that existed at the boundary between legitimate institutional power and the kind of power that doesn't appear in any institution's records. She'd imagined someone with the smooth operational affect of a man who had learned to exist in that boundary space without friction. The man standing as the parking garage had shed the smooth operational effect entirely. He was in a dark coat, his tie loosened, a phone in his left hand and nothing in his right, and his face had the specific quality of a man who has made a decision and is now standing inside the consequences of it and finding them different than anticipated. Not afraid exactly. Something more complicated. The particular expression of someone who still believes, even now, that he can explain his way to a better outcome. 2 of Lucien's men were positioned at the garage's east exit, exactly as Vasquez had said. They were present and armed and entirely superfluous to what was happening in the center of the space, which had nothing to do with physical threat and everything to do with something older and worse. Seraphina stopped at the edge of the scene. Lucien hadn't looked at her when she came through the door. His entire attention was on Reeves, and the quality of that attention was unlike anything she'd seen from him in 3 weeks. Not the controlled reading, not the measured processing. Something stripped. Something that had gotten through the structure. "Tell me why," Lucien said. His voice was level. That was the worst part of it. The absolute levelness. The surface holding when everything beneath it was clearly not holding. Reeves shifted his weight. "It was never about you personally," Reeves said. "You know that." "Tell me why," Lucien said again. "The Castillo organization has been building toward a legislative play for 3 years. The records in this building, your records, are the last obstacle. You've been collecting leverage on people whose cooperation they need. Judges, city council, 2 federal prosecutors." He paused. "Destroying those records doesn't hurt you directly. It removes the obstacle. And you decided that was acceptable. I decided that the alternative was worse." Reeves's voice had the tight, controlled quality of a man who has rehearsed this conversation and is finding the rehearsal inadequate. If Castillo escalates beyond the records, if they go after the people those records protect by going after you directly, your people, this building, the damage is worse. I was limiting damage by trading my operations documentation to people who want to bury me, by giving them something that gets them what they need without killing anyone. Lucien's voice dropped. "That's the sentence you stopped before." Reeves said nothing. "Cole?" The name came out with something in it, not softness, but the register of someone who has said a name 1,000 times and is saying it now for a specific final purpose. "I sent your daughter to her school in Geneva. I paid for her medical treatment 2 years ago when the insurance denied the claim. I have known you for 11 years. "I know," Reeves said, "and you put 2 explosive devices on my building tonight. No one was supposed to. One of my men is in the hospital." Lucien's voice didn't rise. "His name is Anton. He has 3 children. He's been with me for 6 years." The garage was very quiet. Seraphina could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear Reeves breathing from 20 feet away. The accelerated, uneven rhythm of someone whose body was disagreeing with the position his mind had taken. "They would have killed you," Reeves said. It came out differently than the other sentences, without the rehearsed quality, without the legal architecture of justification, just the raw statement of a man speaking from underneath his own reasoning. "If I hadn't given them the access, if I'd refused, they would have come at you with everything, Lucien, not the records, you, and everyone in this building." So you chose to help them come at me halfway. I chose to buy time. Time for what? Reeves opened his mouth, closed it. And in the silence that followed, Seraphina understood what Lucien already understood, that there was no answer to that question that held up, that the logic Reeves had constructed to justify what he'd done had a floor that wasn't there, and he was standing on it, and he was feeling it give way in real time. I have her, Lucien said quietly. Reeves went very still. Your daughter is in Geneva, Lucien continued. She's safe. She's been safe. Whatever they told you they had on her, whatever they used, it was leverage, not capability. They were never going to touch her. She was bait. He paused. You traded 11 years and 2 explosive devices and one of my best men for leverage that was never real. The sound Reeves made was not a word. Not. It was the sound of a structure coming down. All of it. The justifications and the architecture and the careful logical construction of a man who had told himself a story about limited damage and acceptable sacrifice and had been too afraid and too trapped to see the story for what it was. He sat down on the garage floor. Not dramatically, not collapsingly, just sat, the way a person sits when the legs have decided before the rest of the body. Lucien looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned. He saw Seraphina. Something crossed his face, not anger at her presence, not even surprise, just the recognition of her, specific and immediate, the way you recognize something that has become necessary without your quite deciding it would be. He walked toward her. She met him in the middle of the space. Up close, he looked like what he was, a man who had just lost something that had been part of the load-bearing structure of his life for 11 years and was still upright, still moving, still functional, but at a cost she could see in the particular way his jaw was set and the small muscle working in his temple. Anton, she said. How bad? Stable, he said. Burns on his left arm. He'll keep the arm. She nodded. The records? Intact, thanks to you. And Reeves? Lucien glanced back at the man sitting on the garage floor with his hands over his face. He'll be handled, Lucien said. The flatness of it communicated the depth beneath it. Not cruelty, but the particular heaviness of someone who has to do a thing they take no satisfaction in. What does handled mean? He looked at her. It means he doesn't do this again, he said, and it means his daughter stays safe. Those 2 things aren't in conflict. She held his gaze. Okay, she said. But then... The next 4 hours were the controlled chaos of aftermath. Securing the garage, processing the men from the records room, managing the exterior damage from the vehicles and the building's operational response to what had just happened. Seraphina worked alongside Alara through most of it, doing the things she did best, organizing information, tracking moving parts, keeping the administrative architecture intact while the physical architecture was being assessed and repaired. She didn't stop moving until 4 in the morning. At 4:15, she was back in the conference room with the eastern view, not working, just sitting with a glass of water and her hand wrapped in the bandaging Alara had insisted on, looking at the city beginning its slow turn from nighttime to the gray edge of dawn. Lucien came in at 4:30. He sat down across from her. He looked like he'd been awake for 30 hours, which was probably accurate, but he carried it the way he carried everything, present in it, not performing past it. They sat in silence for a while. What happens now? She said finally. Now we go to the harbor, he said. She looked at him. The original exchange, he said. Friday night. It's still happening. Lucien, it's Thursday morning. Whatever Castillo planned for tonight didn't work. They'll adjust. Yes. Which means Friday is different than we planned for. Yes. And you're still going. There are people at that exchange who have been in business with me for years, he said. People who will be there regardless of what Castillo does or doesn't do. If I don't show, they read it as weakness or collapse. The organization fractures. He looked at her steadily. The harbor exchange is not optional. She turned her water glass in her hands. Then we need to know what Castillo has adjusted to, she said, which means we need to know who else in your organization they've had contact with. Lucien was quiet. You've already started running that assessment, she said. It wasn't a question. Since 2 hours ago, he said, Vasquez is leading it. And? So far, Reeves is the only confirmed contact, But Castillo has been methodical. He paused. They don't need another insider. They have enough from Reeves to make Friday dangerous in ways it wasn't dangerous yesterday. They know your security configuration for the harbor. The configuration I had planned, yes. So change it. I've already changed it. Change it again? She said. Whatever your second configuration is, assume they can get to it. Build a third one that nobody knows except you and Vasquez, and assume that Vasquez might also be compromised until you've confirmed he isn't. Lucien looked at her. That's a very cold way to think about people, he said. Yes, she said. It is. I learned it from 8 years of having someone manage information around me and discovering that the paranoia I should have felt earlier would have saved me significant damage. She held his gaze. I'm not saying don't trust Vasquez. I'm saying build a system that doesn't require you to. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. She nodded. They sat in silence for another few minutes. Outside, the city was lightening, the first imperceptible shift from black to deep gray that preceded the dawn, the way change precedes itself before becoming visible. When this is over, Lucien said. She waited. I need you to know that the reason you're in this building has been the same thing since the second week. He didn't look away from her. Not Damon, not the records, you. She held very still. I know, she said. I should have told you before the 3 a.m. conversation. Yes, she said, you should have. I'm telling you now. I know, she said again. And then, because it was true, and because she was done being the woman who swallowed true things. Me too. The city went on lightening outside the window. Friday arrived like a verdict. The harbor at night was a different world than the harbor by day. The commercial infrastructure of it, the cranes and containers and loading equipment, became at night a geography of shadow and industrial sound, the water black and reflecting broken light, the smell of salt and diesel and something organic. The ocean contributed without apology. Seraphina had been to the harbor once before, years ago, a charity event on a rented boat that Damon had attended primarily to be seen at. She remembered the harbor as the backdrop to a performance. Tonight it was the stage. They arrived in 2 vehicles, Lucien and Seraphina in the first, Vasquez and 3 others in the second, the 2 cars separating at the harbor entrance and approaching the south pier by different routes as Lucien had reconfigured. The new plan had been built in the hours between dawn and dusk, and committed to memory rather than paper, 3 iterations in and unknown to anyone outside the vehicle they were currently in. Seraphina was in dark clothing, practical, Alara's word when she'd laid it out, which in context meant nothing that caught light or restricted movement. She had no weapon. She'd been offered one and had declined not from pacifism, but from the honest assessment that a gun in the hands of someone who had fired one twice in her life, and once into a garage ceiling, would be a liability rather than an asset. What she had instead was the harbor's layout memorized, a radio on the second channel, and the specific alertness of someone who had been running on adrenaline and purpose for 18 hours and had arrived at the place where the body stops feeling it and just becomes it. Lucien checked the radio once, put it in his jacket pocket. The exchange is at the north end of Pier 7, he said. The Castillo people will be positioned somewhere between Pier 5 and Pier 9, wide enough to cover multiple approach routes, but concentrated enough to execute. They'll wait until the exchange is underway before they move. How many? Based on what Reeves gave them, 8 to 12, plus whatever backup they've positioned on the water. And our people? 7 on land, 2 boats. He looked at her. I need you at the secondary container position. It's elevated, it has a sight line to the full south end of the pier, and it's the position with the most information value tonight. You want me as an observer. I want you as the person who notices things other people miss, he said. Radio me anything you see that doesn't fit. She nodded. And if things go wrong, then you move to this boat at Pier 4 and you get off the water. His voice was precise and direct. No room in it for negotiation. Not toward the action. Away. That's the one thing I need from you tonight. Okay, she said. He looked at her with that dark, specific attention. Okay, he said back. The car stopped 200 meters from the pier entrance. They got out. The cold hit her immediately. Harbor cold, the kind that comes off water and has weight to it, pressing through fabric and finding skin. She pulled her collar up and followed Lucien's route in the dark, moving along the side of the container yard, the massive steel boxes stacked 4 high around them, creating a canyon geography of shadow and tight corners and the distant sound of water. She split off at the secondary container position, a maintenance platform elevated 4 meters, accessed by a fixed ladder bolted to the side of a shipping container, invisible from the pier until you were directly beneath it. She climbed, the metal cold under her hands, and settled into the position and looked out at the full field of view. Pier 7 stretched north from her position. The exchange point was visible, a cleared area between 2 container stacks, a single work light running on a generator, the small, deliberate stage of a transaction that needed just enough light to operate. 2 men from Lucien's side were already in position near the light. She heard footsteps on the pier, then voices. Low, the language of men who do regular business together, the specific ease of professional familiarity. 4 figures coming from the north, meeting the 2 already present, the exchange beginning its procedural architecture. Seraphina scanned the dark beyond the work light. She looked at Pier 5, Pier 6, the gap between the container stacks on the south side of the yard, the water line where a boat with its running lights off would be invisible against the dark harbor surface. She found it in 40 seconds. Not a boat. 2 boats, both dark, positioned off the east side of Pier 6, and the specific stillness of something waiting, not drifting, anchored with intent. She keyed the radio. 2 boats, east side of Pier 6, she said. Dark, anchored, static. Then Lucien's voice, low. Confirmed. We have them. She kept scanning. The exchange at Pier 7 was progressing, the figures moving through its choreography with the focused efficiency of people who wanted to be done and gone. She watched the periphery, the dark corridors between containers, the places where shadow accumulated with purpose. She found the first man at Pier 5's entrance, a shape that was too still to be incidental, positioned with his back against a container with a sightline to Pier 7. Second man, elevated, on top of the second container stack on the west side. Third, moving along the waterline, slow, not a dock worker's walk. She radioed each position in sequence, her voice steady, the information clean. Lucien acknowledged each one with 2 words or less. The exchange continued at Pier 7, oblivious or performing oblivion, she couldn't tell from her position. Then the work light went out. Not gradually, all at once. The pier went dark, and the darkness was immediate and total, and Seraphina pressed herself flat against the platform surface and strained for information with every available sense. Sound, movement, the geography she'd memorized. A gunshot from Pier 6 east side. Then 3 in rapid succession from a different direction. Then the harbor came alive. She heard running, multiple people, multiple directions, the specific chaos of an ambush that had been triggered before its designated moment. Someone had moved early. She pressed the radio. Shots from Pier 6 east. They moved before the exchange completed. I know, Lucien's voice. Tight, but controlled. Stay down. She stayed down. Below her, between the container stacks, 3 figures moved fast through the canyon. Not Lucien's people, the wrong direction, converging toward something. She tracked them in the dark, her eyes adjusted now, the faint ambient light of the harbor doing just enough. They were moving toward Pier 7, toward the exchange point, toward Lucien. She keyed the radio. 3 on foot between containers, approaching Pier 7 from the south, 20 seconds out. Static. Lucien. Static. Lucien, respond. Nothing. She looked at the ladder. She looked at Pier 4 and the boat she'd been told to move to if things went wrong. The direction away from the action, the exit, the survival option that was real and available in 30 seconds from where she was sitting. She thought about all the times in 8 years she'd taken the exit. All the times the door had been open and she'd walked through it because walking through it meant not having to stand in the place where the difficult thing was happening. All the ways she'd made herself smaller and quieter and less present and called it wisdom, called it pragmatism, called it knowing her limits. She looked at Pier 7. She went down the ladder. The concrete was wet under her feet, the salt air sharp in her lungs, and she moved through the container canyon in the dark with her hand on the steel wall beside her and her heartbeat loud in her own ears. Not panicked, just present, the full percussion of a body that has committed to a direction. She came out at the south end of Pier 7 in time to see the work light come back on. Lucien was at the center of the pier with Vasquez on his left, and two of the exchange party behind them, and the three men she'd tracked through the containers had emerged from the south. All of them stopped, all of them at the specific equilibrium of a confrontation that hasn't yet resolved into violence but is a breath away from it. And at the north end of the pier, visible now in the work light's restored reach, a figure she recognized. Damon Mercer, standing with three men she didn't know, in a coat that was wrong for the harbor, with the expression of a man who had walked to the edge of something and was only now understanding how far down the other side went. The man closest to Lucien, Castillo's lead, she understood from the way the others deferred to him, was speaking. She caught the last of it as she cleared the final container stack and came onto the open pier. Walk away from the records and we call this settled. Simple. Nothing about this is simple, Lucien said. You're outnumbered. Counting was never your organization's strong point. A beat. Then the Castillo lead looked past Lucien's shoulder and saw Seraphina. His expression registered her, assessed her, dismissed her in under 2 seconds, the evaluation of someone who looks at an unarmed woman in the middle of a standoff and sees 0 threat variables. That dismissal, she thought, was his second worst mistake of the evening. His worst mistake was standing between her and Lucien. She walked forward. Lucien heard her footsteps and turned his head. A fraction, not losing the room. And something in his posture changed. Not alarm. The opposite of alarm. Something that recalibrated around her presence the way a structure recalibrates when a load-bearing element returns to position. The Castillo lead said something to the man on his right. The man moved toward her. She stopped walking. She looked past the man moving toward her, past the Castillo lead, past Lucien and Vasquez, to Damon at the far end of the pier. Damon was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on him in 8 years of marriage. Not contempt, not the performance of superiority, not the particular careful blankness he'd worn when he was managing her. He was looking at her with something that might have been recognition. The specific look of a man who has spent months dismantling someone and is standing in front of the evidence that the dismantling didn't work. "Damon," she said. Her voice carried across the pier in the cold air, clean and specific. He said nothing. "You called me," she said. "That night, you called me to warn me." She kept her eyes on him. "Not him, not anyone else. Me." She paused. "That means something, whether you want it to or not." The man moving toward her had stopped. The geometry of the standoff had shifted, not resolved, not reduced, but shifted, everyone recalibrating around the variable of her voice in this space. "Step away from them," she said to Damon. "Right now. Walk to the east side of the pier and step away." "Seraphina." His voice was rough, stripped. "You don't understand what's been promised." "I understand exactly what's been promised," she said. "I've seen the records. I know what you borrowed and from whom and what you put up as collateral. I know all of it." She paused. "And I know you traded my location in this building to people who were going to use me to get to him. You know what that is, Damon." He said nothing. "That's the thing you don't come back from," she said, not with anger. The anger had burned through to something cleaner. "Not because I won't forgive you, because you won't forgive yourself. You knew what it meant and you did it anyway, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that." She held his gaze. "So step away. Right now. Don't make it worse." A beat. The harbor breathed around them, the water against the pier, the distant sounds of the boats on the east side that were no longer waiting. Damon Mercer took 2 steps to the left, and then the pier exploded into motion. Vasquez moved first, into the Castillo lid before the man had finished processing the change in the room. And the 3 men from the container canyon came in from the south simultaneously, and the night became the specific violent geometry of people who have trained for this, executing that training in real time. And Seraphina stood in the middle of it and did not move. The man who'd been walking toward her had turned toward the larger threat. She stepped back, kept her footing on the wet pier, kept her eyes on Lucien. Lucien moved like something built for this. Not the balletic choreography of fiction, but the hard, efficient violence of a man who has survived this kind of situation many times by being completely present in it, processing faster than the people around him, making decisions in the fractions of seconds before those decisions stopped being available. He had the Castillo lead against the pier railing in under 8 seconds. The lead said something, Lucien said something back, one sentence that she couldn't hear from where she was standing. The lead stopped resisting. The fight went out of the pier in stages, the way violence dissipates when the central fact of the matter has been resolved and the peripheral actors register it. One man down on the south side, not dead. 2 more contained by Vasquez and the others, the third from the containers running and not making it far. And then it was just the harbor and the water and the cold and the specific ringing silence that follows. Seraphina looked for Lucien. He was 3 meters from where she was standing. He was looking at her. He had a cut above his left eye that was bleeding freely down the side of his face, and his breathing was elevated. She could see it, the chest working harder than usual, the body's honest accounting of what it had just done. And he was looking at her with that reading attention and something beneath it that had finally stopped being held in check. "I told you to go to the boat," he said, breathing hard through the words. "I know," she said. "Seraphina. They were going to come in behind you," she said. 3 men, 20 seconds out. You weren't answering the radio. What would you have done? He looked at her for a long moment. Blood ran down the side of his face and dripped off his jaw, and he didn't lift his hand to it. "The same thing," he said. She crossed the 3 meters between them. She reached up and pressed her palm against the cut above his eye. Not gently, with pressure, the way you address a wound rather than perform tenderness. And he went very still under the contact, the whole of him becoming still, and she felt his hand come up and close around her wrist, not pulling her hand away, just holding it there. They stood like that on the wet pier with the harbor all around them and the city in the distance doing its indifferent, brilliant work against the dark sky. "Damon?" she said, without looking away from Lucien. "Vasquez has him," Lucien said. "What happens to him?" A pause. "That depends on him," Lucien said. "Not on me." She understood what he meant and what he was giving her. The space to have a position on it, the acknowledgement that this was not exclusively his to decide. She lowered her hand from his face. He didn't let go of her wrist. "It's over," she said. "This part," he said. "Yes." She looked up at him. The cut, the blood, the dark eyes that had been reading her since a rain-soaked alley 4 weeks ago, that had seen something in a woman shielding a stranger with her body and had not forgotten what it saw. "What's the next part?" she said. He looked at her, and somewhere behind them, at the north end of the pier, Damon Mercer sat down on the wet concrete and put his face in his hands and made a sound that carried across the water like something that had been held for a long time finally running. The sound Damon made carried across the water, and then the harbor swallowed it, and there was nothing left but the cold and the wet concrete and the distant machinery of a city that had no interest in what had just happened on Pier 7. Vasquez crouched beside Damon without touching him. Not comforting him, just present, the way a person is present near something that might still be dangerous and might just be finished. Damon's shoulders were moving with the irregular rhythm of a man breathing through something his body had decided to do without consulting the rest of him. His coat was too thin for the harbor cold. He hadn't dressed for this. He hadn't dressed for any of this. Not in the way that mattered. Not in the ways that couldn't be fixed with the right fabric. Seraphina watched him from 20 feet away. Lucien had stepped back from her wrist when Vasquez called his name, the operational world reasserting its claim on him with the specific efficiency it always used. And now he was 15 feet to her left, managing the aftermath of the pier, the restrained men, the radio communication with the boats on the east side, the accounting of what had happened and what it would require going forward. She could hear his voice doing its work, low and even. The structure of him intact in the way she'd come to understand was not coldness, but endurance. She kept watching Damon. He lifted his head eventually, looked at her. The harbor light caught his face from the wrong angle and made him look older than she'd ever seen him. Not old in years, but old in the specific way of a man who has run out of the thing that made him feel young, which had never been youth itself, but the belief that he was still ahead of the consequences of his choices. He wasn't ahead of them anymore. He was sitting in them on wet concrete at the end of a pier with his hands open in his lap, like a man who has put down something heavy and found that putting it down didn't make his arms stop hurting. She walked toward him. Vasquez looked at her. She held up one hand, a small gesture, not commanding, just requesting space. And Vasquez read it and straightened and stepped back. She stood in front of Damon. He looked up at her from the ground, and she looked down at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment, the harbor filling the silence with its indifferent vocabulary of water and wind and the far-off machinery of commerce that never stops. "I didn't think they'd actually use you," he said. His voice had the rough texture of something that had been through weather. "When I told them, I thought it was—" He stopped, started again. "I told myself it was information that would never become action, that they'd use it as leverage in a negotiation, and that would be the end of it." "You knew they were capable of action," she said. "Yes." "You knew what they did to people who couldn't pay." "Yes." "So you told yourself a story," she said, "because the true version was something you couldn't live in." He looked at her hands, the bandaged right one, the cut from the cabinet edge that had bled through the wrapping on the harbor climb and dried there, rust-colored against the white. "I did that," he said. "Yes." "Seraphina, don't," she said. Not harshly, just with finality, the specific finality of a word that has no argument available to it, because it isn't an argument. It's a door. He stopped. She crouched down to his level. Not to comfort him, not to close the distance between them, but because standing over him felt like the wrong geometry for what she needed to say, and she had always done her best thinking close to the ground. "I'm going to tell you one true thing," she said, "and then I'm not going to say anything else to you tonight. Are you listening?" He nodded. "You're not the worst version of yourself," she said. "You did a terrible thing and you'll carry it, and there's no version of this where that weight goes away. But you called me. In the middle of all of it, with all the choices you'd already made, you called me. Not to save yourself, to save me." She held his eyes. "That matters. Not as a debt I owe you. Not as a reason to forgive what came before it. It matters because it's the last true thing you did, and you should know that it was seen." Damon's face did something complicated and painful, and she watched it happen and didn't look away. "What happens now?" he said. "That's not my question to answer," she said. She stood up. She looked at Vasquez. Vasquez nodded once. She walked back toward Lucien and didn't look at Damon again. Pato. The formal accounting happened over the following week. Not loudly. Nothing in this world happened loudly. That was one of the first things she'd understood about Lucien's operation, the way consequence moved through it like water through stone, rather than like weather through open air. Slow, thorough, reshaping everything it touched without announcing itself. The Castillo lead, his name was Ernesto Varga, she learned from Alara's briefing, was processed through a mechanism she was not privy to and had not asked to be privy to, emerging 3 days later in a position that was not prison and was not freedom, but was something in between that would occupy the remainder of his operational career. The organization he represented contracted visibly in the weeks that followed. Not destroyed. These structures were not destroyed. They adapted and regrouped and found new shapes, but reduced. Set back by years in the specific ways that mattered. Cole Reeves's daughter was in Geneva and stayed in Geneva, safe, her security arrangements upgraded without fanfare. Cole Reeves himself was gone from Draven Tower and gone from the city by the following Tuesday. Seraphina asked Lucien once where he'd gone, and Lucien said somewhere with enough distance to rebuild, and she understood that was all she would get, and that it was probably the most honest answer available. Anton, who had 3 children and had been with Lucien for 6 years, and had lost neither his arm nor his life. On the night the building's east wall took damage, was out of the hospital in 8 days. Lucien visited him on the 3rd day, and the 7th day, and the discharge day, each time alone, each time without announcement. Seraphina knew because she saw him leave and return with the specific quality of a man who has been somewhere that cost him something and has paid it willingly. She didn't ask him about those visits. Some things were not hers to ask about. Damon Mercer's situation resolved itself through the mechanisms that had always been waiting for it. The Castillo debt became public record when his remaining financial structures collapsed under the weight of the corruption investigation that had been building for 2 years and had, in the chaos of the harbor night, lost its last political obstacle. The investigation moved quickly after that. His assets were frozen. His name appeared in the financial press with the particular frequency of a story that has finally found its ending. He was not charged with the harbor incident. That was Lucien's decision, and when Seraphina asked him about it, directly, because she'd stopped being indirect about things that mattered, he said that charging Damon publicly would have required making the harbor publicly legible, and making the harbor publicly legible would have cost people who didn't deserve the cost. The financial investigation was enough. The investigation would do the work that needed doing. She sat with that for 2 days. Then she agreed with it, which was different from accepting it because she had to. The building changed around her in increments she tracked without meaning to. The guest room on the 31st floor became something that was no longer legible as a guest room. Her books on the shelves, her legal pads in the desk drawer, her coffee cup on the windowsill with the ring left from 3 weeks of morning use. She hadn't decided to stay in any single moment. She had decided it in the accumulated weight of every day she'd found reasons not to leave. Elara stopped calling her Ms. Vale sometime around the 3rd week after the harbor. The shift happened without announcement, the way Elara did everything, practical, forward-facing, a decision communicated through action rather than discussion. She became Seraphina in Elara's vocabulary and stayed there. The work expanded naturally, the way work does when you are genuinely good at it, and the people around you are not going to diminish that goodness for their own comfort. The Foundation's reporting architecture was rebuilt from the ground up. 3 months of dense, satisfying labor that produced a structure cleaner and more defensible than anything that had existed before. She found 2 additional organizations embedded in the city's social service network that were doing critical work without adequate funding and brought them into the Foundation's umbrella with Lucien's agreement. He agreed without hesitation. That was the thing she kept noticing. The absence of the specific friction she'd spent 8 years managing. Not that there was no friction. Lucien disagreed with her regularly, directly, without softening it, and expected the same in return. They argued about operational decisions and organizational structure, and once, memorably, about whether a particular Foundation grant recipient's accounting practices were the result of incompetence or something more deliberate, an argument that lasted 3 days and ended with Seraphina being right and Lucien acknowledging it in 3 words and both of them moving forward. The friction was real and the friction was clean, and nothing in it was designed to make her smaller. She understood the difference now in her body, not just her mind, the way you understand something when you've lived on both sides of it. 2 months after the harbor, she was in the Foundation's office space on the 20th floor. A real office now, with her name on the door in the simple sans serif that Lucien used for everything. No title, just the name. When Elara appeared in the doorway with an expression she hadn't seen before. "There's someone downstairs," Elara said. "Who?" "He says his name is Marco." Seraphina looked up from the desk. "He's 12, Elara added. "He has his mother." She went downstairs. The boy in the lobby was not wearing the blue jacket. He was wearing a school uniform, slightly askew at the collar, and he was taller than she remembered and had the specific self-consciousness of a child who has been told he is doing something brave and is trying to live up to the telling. His mother stood beside him, a woman in her 40s with the carefully composed expression of someone who has been frightened for a long time and is still in the process of learning what safety feels like. Marco looked at Seraphina when she came out of the elevator. He had the same eyes. She'd remembered them correctly, the eyes of someone who had been afraid long enough that afraid had become a baseline rather than a state. They were different now, still careful, but different. "I wanted to say thank you," he said. His voice was the voice of a boy still negotiating the territory between child and something else. "My mom said I should wait, but I wanted to come before I—" He stopped, recalibrated. "I just wanted to." Seraphina looked at him. She thought about the alley and the rain and the wet asphalt under her knees and the small hands grabbing her coat in the dark, and she thought about all the versions of that night that could have gone differently and didn't. And she thought about what it meant that this boy was standing in a lobby in a school uniform with his mother beside him and the careful but different eyes. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to anyway." She crouched down to his level, the same instinct as the alley, the same geometry of taking the ground that made the conversation equal, and looked at him. "Are you okay?" she said. He thought about it with the seriousness of a child who takes questions literally. "Mostly," he said. "Sometimes at night it's—" He gestured vaguely, the gesture of someone who doesn't have the vocabulary yet for what happens at night. "I know," she said. That takes time. Does it go away? She looked at him. It changes, she said. It doesn't go away, but it changes into something you can carry without it being the only thing you're carrying. He nodded slowly, processing it with that same literal seriousness. Okay, he said. She stood up. She extended her hand to his mother, who took it with both of hers and held it for a moment and didn't say anything, which was its own complete sentence. There are resources through the foundation, Seraphina said, for families who've been through what yours has. I'll have Alara send the information. The mother nodded. Her eyes were very bright. Marco looked at the lobby, at the building around him, with the curiosity of a child locating himself in a story he doesn't fully understand yet. Is this where you live now? He asked. Yes, she said. Is it safe? She looked around the lobby, the clean lines of it, the functional architecture, the people moving through it with purpose. Through the glass doors, the city was doing its daytime work in full autumn light, the sky the specific clear blue that arrived after a long period of rain. Yes, she said. The evening she thought of later as the actual ending, not the harbor, not the records room, not any of the events that had the quality of plot, was an ordinary Tuesday in November. She was at the window on the 31st floor, not the guest room window, her window, in the space that had reorganized itself around her presence, the way spaces do when presence becomes permanent. The city below was doing its blue hour work, the moment between day and night when the light goes horizontal and everything becomes briefly gold and exact. She heard Lucien come in. She knew his footsteps the way you know the footsteps of someone you've lived alongside, not consciously cataloged, just present in the body as information, the specific rhythm of that measured, unhurried walk that she'd been listening to for months. He stood beside her at the window. Neither of them spoke for a while. This was one of the things she hadn't expected, the silence between them. In 8 years with Damon, silence had always been weighted, always carrying something unresolved, always requiring management or interpretation or the careful performance of ease. She had spent 8 years being exhausted by silence. This silence was just the shared presence of two people looking at the same thing and not needing to translate it. The Hargrove application came through, she said. I saw. They'll be able to expand the shelter capacity by March. Good. A pause. The city moved through its blue hour below them, 1,000 windows catching the last horizontal light. Cole's daughter sent a letter, Lucien said. She looked at him. She doesn't know what happened, he said. She knows her father is gone, and she knows who paid her school fees for 4 years, and she wanted to say, he paused. She wanted to say she hopes he's somewhere he can be better. Seraphina looked at his face. The scar above his left eye had healed to a thin, pale line, barely visible now, only legible if you knew to look for it, which she did. How are you with that? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Working on it, he said. She nodded. That was the honest answer. That was the only honest answer available to any of it. Not resolved, not healed over, not converted into something clean and completed. Working on it. The ongoing labor of a person who has sustained damage and has decided to remain a person anyway. She turned back to the window. There's something I've been meaning to tell you, she said. Tell me. The night in the alley, when you asked if I could walk and I said yes. She paused. I wasn't sure. My legs were doing something I'd never felt before. But I said yes because the alternative was staying in the alley, and staying in the alley wasn't an option I was willing to take. He looked at her. I know, he said. You couldn't have known that. I knew from the way you stood up, he said. You stood up the way people stand up when they're not certain their body will cooperate, but they've already decided it doesn't matter. She turned to look at him fully. You've been reading me since the alley, she said. Yes. And what did you read? He looked at her with those dark eyes, the reading quality fully present, everything in it visible to her now in a way it hadn't been 4 months ago, because she'd learned the language of him the way you learn a language when you're immersed in it, not by studying it, but by living inside it until it becomes the language you think in. Someone who had been told the wrong story about herself for long enough that she'd started to believe it, he said. But not all the way. There was something left that the story hadn't reached. He paused. That's what I saw. She held his gaze. And now? She said. He reached out and put his hand against the side of her face. The same careful deliberateness he applied to everything, nothing performed, nothing wasted. And she leaned into it slightly, the weight of her head against his palm, and looked at him. Now I see someone who knows the true story, he said. Outside, the city completed its blue hour and shifted into the full dark of evening, 10,000 windows coming on simultaneously in the way that always looked like something becoming visible rather than something being illuminated. The harbor was out there somewhere in the dark, the Pier 7 concrete still bearing the marks of a night that had cost everyone present something real. Cole Reeves was somewhere with distance between him and the life he'd broken. Damon Mercer was in the process of accounting for the architecture of his choices with the specific thoroughness that process always required. Anton was home with his 3 children, his left arm in a compression sleeve, relearning the texture of ordinary days. Marco was in his bedroom somewhere in this city, in the occasional grip of nights that were difficult, carrying the things she'd told him he would carry, not alone, not without support, but carrying it, because that was the only honest relationship available to the things that happened to you. And she was here, at this window, in this life. Seraphina Vale took Lucien's hand from her face and held it in both of hers, and turned back to the city below, the full illuminated geography of it, the place that had watched her arrive and watched her diminish and watched her sign papers under fluorescent lights and had not cared, because cities don't care, they just continue. And she felt the particular specific gravity of a moment that was real. Not happiness, though happiness was present. Not safety, though she was safe. Something more fundamental than either. The sensation of being located, of knowing exactly where she was and having chosen to be there and understanding that the choosing had been hers from the first moment she'd stood in a rain-soaked alley and refused to run. No more ghosts, Lucien said. She looked at the city. She thought about the woman in the courthouse on a rainy morning with the buzzing fluorescent lights and the indifferent clerk and the divorce papers pressed flat under a pen that didn't shake. She thought about that woman and felt toward her what she'd been unable to feel at the time. Not pity, nothing so condescending as that, but a specific clear tenderness for someone who was carrying more than she knew and was about to be asked to carry more still and would do it, was doing it, would come through the other side of it into this exact evening, in this exact window, with this exact view. No, she said. Only the future. Lucien's fingers closed around hers. Outside, the city breathed on beneath the dark and the light, indifferent and brilliant and full of the ongoing, unmappable complexity of 10,000 lives conducting their private negotiations with consequence and loss and the stubborn, persistent fact of continuing. And inside the window, 2 people who had been shaped by damage into something more precise than they'd been before stood together in the manner of people who have chosen each other, not from the softness of feeling, but from the hard, specific knowledge of what the other person is made of, having seen it demonstrated in the places where it counted. That was the story, not the harbor, not the records room, not the alley in the rain or the courthouse or the divorce papers or the man on his knees in the ruins of everything he'd built with his own hands. Those were the events. The story was this: a woman who had been told the wrong story about herself for long enough that she'd almost believed it. And what happened when she stopped? What happened was not rescue. What happened was recognition, her own first. Everything else followed from that. The city moved and breathed in the dark below the window, and the night came on fully, and the lights of 10,000 lives burned against it. And Seraphina Vale stood inside her own life, chosen, located, real, and let herself remain there without apology or qualification, which was the hardest and most necessary thing she had ever done, and which was, at last, enough.